Greetings everyone! Today I'm taking a look at Need for Speed, the one from 2015. Do you remember the good old days of Need for Speed with Underground, Underground 2 and Most Wanted? Well, the first one and the good one? Can it live up to this legacy? Let's find out. Need for Speed was a fun playthrough. It didn't overstay its welcome and I currently have 22 hours playtime logged. As usual, there are some flaws though, but let's start with the general information. Need for Speed is an arcade racing game. It has been developed by Ghost Games and published by EA in, as I said, 2015. It is seen as the reboot of the franchise, which would explain the confusing name that requires the year to be supplied every time. I'm not a fan of companies doing this, but not being able to increment the numbers correctly or having run out of creative ideas to name things seems to be a commonplace in the industry sometimes. It was criticized for having an always online mode, or required always online when it came out. Today this has sadly become more of a norm than an aberration for most games. This saddens me because many great games are unplayable by now due to this, or will become unplayable in the future once some manager somewhere decides it's not worth the cost anymore to have the servers running. The gameplay is usually starting at the garage where you manage your cars. Managing cars means buying, selling, choosing and tuning visuals and performance. Then it's off to the open world map with the car and driving to missions or just explore. Mission variety is decent, but nothing really unexpected in this racing game. Some examples. There's a drift train mode, my probably least favorite of them all. You need a certain amount of points, which you get from drifting and staying with the group. The problem with this mode is that the group often breaks up and you don't get points at all because someone is way too far behind or way too far ahead or something. Then there's Drift Race, kind of like a timed race to the finish line with a drift point amount that has to be reached while getting there. There's also another drift race where you just have a certain amount of time on a circuit to get drift points against other competitors. Circuit race, the standard multiple lap race. A sprint race where you just have basically one lap to be first. Then the drag race where you switch over to manual transmission and you have to just accelerate the fastest basically. But there haven't been a lot of drag races in my playthrough. And then there's also, while on the open world, you can fight with the police. This one felt very bad to me because the police never felt like any threat. They only followed you and sometimes they put up roadblocks, but they could easily be avoided. There are a few more types I did not list here, but those are basically the ones above with a tiny twist to them. So all in all, the basic standard fare for a Need for Speed game, or a racing game in general. For character progression there are a few aspects. Acquiring different cars is locked behind a cash wall, not a real money cash wall, but in-game cash wall. Visual tuning, where more items can be unlocked by reputation level. And then there is performance tuning, with most items there being unlocked by reputation level as well, but some of the pieces are locked behind story progression. I overall liked the progression systems used. Let's dive into them a bit more. For the cars, there is a decent amount of cars that can be bought from most brands you would expect. The only limitation I found to this was the amount of garage space and money earned in the game, though money can be earned relatively quickly by just repeating races on the map. The cars can also be visually tuned, of course. color can be selected, you can put on vinyls, I think they're called, decals, you can exchange body parts, and so on and so forth. More parts to use are unlocked by reputation level, which rises by performing certain things during driving. It's easy enough to gain reputation since almost everything you do can give reputation points, like going fast, drifting, destroying stuff, and so on and so forth. I didn't dabble too much in visual tuning after I found the basic simple design I liked for each car I used. The more important part of tuning is the performance tuning. There are a ton of parts that can be upgraded to higher rarity versions, like the motor or suspension, nitro, that stuff, things you would expect. These parts are also mostly unlocked, or higher tiers of those parts are unlocked through reputation level, with the highest required being 50 for all the parts. As I said, some parts are unlocked through story progression, but that's not a big deal. Upgrading some parts will not give a direct performance boost, but allow the fine-tuning of parameters to achieve more drift or more grip. I'm not enough of a car guy to tell you if this is realistic and if the parameters make sense. I generally kept 2 cars around, one for more drift type missions and one for more speed and racing oriented missions, although I found it to be easier with a slight twist towards drift as well. The story is kind of secondary in this game, but still nice that there is something. Obviously, the setting is the tuning community of some made-up coastal city. This is not exactly my cup of tea, but it is to be expected in this kind of game. Basically, it is about a couple of upstarts that want to impress some hero-like characters. Those hero-like car people are actual people, I found out after playing during the research phase of this video. There are in essence 5 people with different playstyles and 5 heroes. Drifting, tuning, racing, doing stuff with others, and outlaw, as in making the police and taxpayers angry. The whole thing is presented with live action cutscenes from time to time, which is a nice touch. After having beaten the final mission, a replay option is unlocked to replay the missions on harder difficulty. I didn't dabble too much in this because at this point I felt like I didn't need more of the same, and especially the same missions again. The first thing about the presentation that I noticed is that the main menu is confusing. It's a tile-style interface like in Windows 8, but at first I was not sure if there is a single-player mode, which game mode I would have to select for the story, and all that stuff, so it was a bit confusing. It's not a big issue after some playing and some playing around, but it's just a bit hard if the first thing I see is confusing me. Overall, the graphics of the game are decent with a few caveats. There is seemingly always rain in Ventura Bay and everything is always wet. This probably was to show how great stuff looks in terms of rain effects for its time. But for me, it was more annoying than beautiful. It didn't help that the game is very flashy overall, and the rain reflections add to that as well. Everything kind of is like glittering all the time. I had to start skipping the mission end screens as well, as fast as possible at some point, because it literally hurt my eyes from the flashes it had there. In terms of story presentation, there are of course the aforementioned live action cutscenes, which are a bit cringy, but I felt they at least had some charm. When not having one of those major cutscenes, the story is progressed through phone calls. Overall, the game has a bit of a focus on smartphones, and different menus apart from the main menu are phone apps. Hints in loading screens are also displayed in a tweet style. I for one never understood why everything has to be put on Twitter or Facebook, and don't see why it had to be that way, but okay. Sound effects are good and match what I expected, however I couldn't get warm with the music. But word of advice, just disable the music in-game and have Spotify running on the side with the music that suits you. I had no issues with the music after I started doing this. I haven't had any crashes, but the loading time sure seemed a bit excessive. Especially when entering a session, the startup of the game. First and foremost, the thing I least expected, this game has no microtransactions or in-game real money store. Bravo, well done EA from 2015. And that's sad, that praise has to be given nowadays to not ruin a game with microtransactions, but I honestly didn't expect this from an EA game. Interestingly, when I was first interrupted from gameplay, I found out the hard way that the game cannot be paused. Not even when in single player mode, which is also a thing that seems to disable itself each time you restart the game. This is a bit of an inconvenience if you have interruptions during play, but the penalties for losing a race are pretty slim, so you don't lose a ton of stuff or progress by not having a pause option. Neat is the open world exploration aspect with things to find. There are mini collectibles like landmarks to collect, with no tangible benefit. However, there are also parts to be found for cars that allow more customization earlier. Also neat is the option to teleport directly to any event on the map, but this feature has not been obvious to me from the beginning. Once I found out how to do it, it significantly reduced overhead of driving from point A to B on the open world. As for the less stellar design decisions, there is for one the focus on drift gameplay. It feels as if most things are centered around drifting, and it takes a bit of time to get used to this. Once I did get used to it and noticed that most curves can be easily drifted by staying on the accelerator and tapping the brakes to achieve increasing drift angles, I could manage most missions on the first go. I also like that rubber banding does not seem to be too noticeable. Perhaps that would have become an issue in the prestige missions that I didn't play, but when I played there was no ridiculous stuff happening like a grandma with walking aid overtaking a Lamborghini or Porsche. It did feel that way in some other Need for Speed titles I played. It has to be said though that the game's difficulty is rather low if you keep your car up to date. So I never really had issues progressing and completing missions at any point. I had to restart perhaps one or two, but that's about it. The racetracks themselves are not locked with invisible walls, and a line on the ground tells you where to go. This is usually not enough to entirely disregard the minimap, but helps staying on track on longer straight sections. However, I never seem to have seen or used obvious shortcuts that were there in previous installments, that you just knew were there after a while playing. The last thing I want to mention is the physics. Sometimes on high speeds, just lightly touching something leads to the car being reduced to rubble and having to be reset. On the flip side, hitting objects at minimal speed lets them fly around as if it hit with high speed. Those are minor issues though and didn't bother me all too much. And that brings us to the summary. Overall, I thoroughly enjoyed playing an arcade racing game once again. The game does have its flaws, certainly, but it is still fun to play even nowadays. I probably wouldn't pick this game up for full price, but there's a decent chance for heavy sales on older titles. As for better alternatives, I don't know the arcade racing market all too well, but a decent remake of the original Undergrounds or Most Wanted would be great for my nostalgia tinted glasses. Ooh, another game from the list covered. Hope you enjoyed. As usual, let me know your experience with the game or ideas for improvements. Also, like and subscribe if you are feeling generous. Thank you very much for watching and see you on the next video.